Hi, welcome to the panel on international education at the 2022 China Education Symposium at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. The symposium was established in 2010, and it aims to provide a platform for practitioners, scholars, and policymakers in the field of education to present the latest research, exchange new ideas, and brainstorm innovative solutions related to education in China. This year, the theme of the symposium is Reinvigorate Aspiration, Reimagine Education. Before going any further, please allow me to introduce all the co-directors of the panel. My name is Camelia Liu, and I'm currently studying education policy and analysis at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
My name is Yang. I'm also currently studying education policy analysis here at Harvard Graduate School of Education.
My name is Max Tan Xidong. I'm currently in the Education Leadership, Organization, and Entrepreneurship program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
We would also like to acknowledge the great work of Yue Liu and all the volunteers, Yihui Li, Su Mi, and Anqi Wang. They're working tirelessly with us behind the scenes.
International education has been a hot topic in recent years in China. The number of international schools and the program almost tripled within 10 years. However, the COVID-19 pandemic and the new national education policy have posed challenges to international education in China. Furthermore, international education that aims to equip students with skills and knowledges to counter the global challenge they face, from climate change to the booming of artificial intelligence, needs to innovate on the current situation. What are these specific challenges facing international education in China? How can innovation take place in the Chinese context and beyond? In this panel, we have the privilege of engaging in a deep conversation on localization of international education in China, continuation, transformation, and innovation.
And we are so honored to have 4 distinguished panelists joining us today. Professor Bruce Binjiang is the founding chairman of the Association for Collaborative Leadership China, who facilitated the establishment of many Sino-foreign programs, including Kunshan University. Welcome, Professor Jiang. Professor Jeffrey Lehman serves as the founding vice chancellor of NYU Shanghai and was named as one of the 40 most influential foreign experts during the first 40 years of reform and opening up in China. Welcome, Professor Lehman. Professor Fernando Reimers is the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education and Director of Global Education Innovation Initiative at Harvard University. He is also a member of UNESCO's Commission on Futures of Education. Welcome, Professor Reimers. And last but not the least, Mr. Fred Hongge Ren is the Assistant Superintendent of Maple Leaf Educational Systems, MLES, and Principal of MLES Research Institute. He is committed to researching and promoting the world's first international curriculum with Chinese characteristics. Welcome, Mr. Ren. Thank you all for coming to our panel discussion today. We are so excited to hear from you all on the topic of localizing international education in China.
Okay, so in the panel discussion today, we will first invite our 4 guests for a short presentation. Then we'll move to roundtable discussions of some of the broader themes. You are more than welcome to engage in the conversation by submitting Q&A questions through the bottom the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom or on the platform you are using. Our volunteers will monitor and collect your feedback, and we'll collect questions from to pose questions to all the panelists. Thank you.
Now, without further ado, let's turn to our panelists for some rich presentations. Over the past few years, the pandemic has posed many difficulties for international education, especially in China. Our first panelist, Professor Binjiang, will share with us how the national situation and the pandemic bring challenges to students in international education entities and to international education institutions, and what advantages international education has under the present condition. Let's welcome Professor Binjiang. Professor Zhang, now the floor is yours.
Professor, you are muted.
Hello, Professor Zhang. I think you should unmute yourself.
现在怎么样？
What about now? Yes, we can hear you now. My apologies, I didn't realize my microphone was on mute. Good morning and good evening to you all. It is my great pleasure to have this opportunity to participate in this year's Harvard CES. In 2007, in June, on behalf of Kunshan People's Government in Jiangsu Province, we have invited Duke University team to Kunshan. So the then provost and president visited Kunshan in June, and from June 1st of 2007, the Duke University delegate headed by the dean of the business school had arrived in Kunshan, and I have worked as the executive vice chairman of the organization committee to introduce the world-class university to Kunshan. And from that day onwards, through the entire process of gaining approvals at the Ministry of Education, I have witnessed and participated in the entire process and have learned a lot in that process. In 2012 and 13, I have taken that opportunity and continued on working in the education cooperation between China and the US. My own understanding of the situation was there were 6 major challenges in cross-border education of international universities. When we talk about cross-border education, we talk about how a foreign education institution come to China and establish a joint education program. The 6 challenges were reflected specifically in first, the attractiveness and the cohesion of the host country to recruit top professors to come to these campuses for long-term retention. And especially for the past 2 years, you know what kind of challenges we're facing. And this is a great challenge we're all facing. And the second challenge is that the host country campus would have differences or gaps in teaching resources and in the cultural heritage. For example, Duke University in the United States, it is a young university, a young renowned university, but calling it young, it has 100 years of history. But in Kunshan, which is a small county level city, we built a campus of Duke University from nothing. And it has the Duke brand image, and it issues the certificate of graduation and the degree from Duke University. We can tell what kind of a difference or gap there is between Duke University in the US and here in Kunshan. And the third challenge is, as we were recruiting students, there is the same challenge in the sustainment of quality at par. A lot of outstanding students will try to get into Duke University. So are they going to go straight to Duke University in the US, or are they going to try and apply for Kunshan Duke University? Of course, they will try to get into the Duke University campuses in the US. And the fourth challenge was that the enrollment scale and alignment of the political, economic, and cultural development of the host country versus the emphasis of research universities in solving major research issues in the future and carrying out liberal arts education at a small scale. And this presents another challenge. The fifth challenge is in the finances. This is also the biggest issue. As I was working in China for so many years, I have spoken to more than 20 provincial and municipal governments, and they all wanted to have a world-class university here in China, but they encounter a lot of challenges in terms of their finances, because we know the financial operations for world-class universities is not reliant on the tuition income. A lot of the tuition is actually being distributed in the form of scholarship to outstanding students. So the sustainability of their finances would not rely on the tuition income. However, in the past 10 years or so, the attempts in China to establish campuses for these universities would rely on local government treasury, which brings a lot of burden on the local government. And the sixth challenge is when we have cross-border education, especially with undergraduate students, of the 4 years of their studies, at least a year would be spent in their mother university. So if we have recruited 300 students, this would mean that they would have to go to the main campus, and the main campus would face the pressure of more students and not enough faculty. So those are the 6 challenges I have observed. With the challenges in mind, why would so many world-class universities still choose to come to another country and build another campus, like New York University, Albany University, Duke University? Albany has been engaging in cross-border education, and more than 230 agencies like this had been spread around the world. And in China, we have less than 10. And student numbers in these cross-border programs and institutions would be around 300,000, and more than 2,100 institutions have been established. For a host country, they are willing to engage in this because of 5 reasons. The first one is, when you have a world-class university facing the global challenges such as the energy crisis, climate change, water pollution, cybersecurity, wealth gap, geopolitical issues, world-class university would like to provide solutions or partial solutions to these issues through cross-border education. When I was speaking to the then president of Duke University, he said that the ambition of Duke University is to resolve global health issues with the other countries together, because no single country could really deal with this challenge of this scale. So they have had a very successful cooperation with Singapore in this area. Just an example. And currently, as we look at the development of digital economy, big data, AI technology, virtual economy or digital economy, these have now become the most important engines for the world to grow, especially economically. And so cross-border education can bring together talents who have been trained in an interdisciplinary and cross-cultural environment. They have an understanding of the different economies, and they are able to promote the development of digital economy. And this actually is very important, both an opportunity and a challenge.
Well, technology is bringing us closer when it comes to cross-border education, and give it the exporter or importer. It truly facilitates the cultivation of qualified world citizens that understand where their roots are and give it to teachers or students. They can become more internationally adaptable. That's the third point. Fourth, is also conducive to the protection of intellectual property rights. China is adamant on entrepreneurship and innovation these days, and are trying to create more and more world-class universities. And for those that are already in Project 211 and Project 985, they are learning from best practices in the world, and they are very important pillars when it comes to point 5. And when the first delegation from Duke arrived in Kunshan, I brought with me a book and a magazine. The book was from Theon Theater, and it is about how 100 CEOs saw China and how they became more interested in China. And they talked about the ambition of China, that world-class universities are not just renowned for their academic calibers, but also for their capabilities of gathering talent, and also their influence on the political discourse and how they set the course straight. And the universities definitely have influences that transcend the academic border. And lastly, I want to share with you some case studies which focus on inheritance of the tradition. Well, now we have 82 independent legal entities that are private universities, among the over 2,000 private universities that are set up in the past few decades. Some of them are top-notch research universities in the world, for example, NYU and DKU. These two universities are already in China. Of course, they want to retain their reputation and quality in China. When they enroll students, they focus on quality. I think the current enrollment per year is around 3,000 or 4,000. No, sorry, I think it's around 300. Duke originally planned to enroll 6,000, and then they decide to contain the overall number of students within around 3,000. This is a research-oriented university, and they want to feature liberal arts. That is one model. Well, for Duke in Kunshan, it is not just a copying the main campus back in the States. While Lin Junyuan Academium mentioned that the curriculum design should be demand, problem, and future-oriented, so that one day the Kunshan campus can become an innovative model of higher education in China and the United States. And Kunshan wants to amount to a milestone of education innovation. And that is the model that research universities follow. And the second would be the teaching universities. Yesterday, I talked to Professor Guo from Princeton. Whenever we talk about teaching universities, people fall into certain stereotypes. Well, there are two, Nottingham and West Liverpool in the UK are teaching oriented. At least that's my might take. Of course, they also have research in the liberal arts, but Yang Fuqiang, an academician from Nottingham University from Ningbo, said that they have both on liberal arts and research, but President Yang believes that the campus itself still focuses on research, but Xi Yumin, the president of Liverpool University, and Xi'an Jiaotong has launched a lot of innovation programs, and in Taichung of Suzhou, they just launched an entrepreneurship program, but still they believe the university itself is prioritizing teaching while still having research in its portfolio and quite a lot of focus on research as well. There are another 3 research-oriented universities, including the Hong Kong Chinese University and the Jing and the Polytech University in Guangzhou, as well as the Hong Kong Baptist University in Zhuhai. And we also have universities focusing on applications, for example, Kane from the US, which has over 100 years. When they came to China, Ministry of Education wanted them to focus on innovation and career innovation in particular. Among the 10 Sino-foreign joint universities that were established in the past 10 to 20 years, and we're still at a very starting point. I once mentioned that a school can settle within 10 years and can achieve certain things in 20 years, but can only shine after at least 30 years. And I often tell them that we're sowing the seeds for the future generations. And when Kunshan was first set up as a branch of Duke, and we received a lot of support. When I talked to Wuhan University said it does not want any credits in supporting us as long as the education in China can prosper with such joint efforts. Well, as you just said, what DKU is sowing seeds in China, and these seeds will become milestones of the century and also will build a bridge for Sino-US education exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jiang, for your excellent presentation. I believe Professor Jiang's talk has revealed the complexity of international education in China. Driven by both internal and external factors, international education is continuously reforming and innovating to explore the way forward. Let's leave the floor for Professor Li Men to continue the education from the perspective of New York University Shanghai, China's first Sino-foreign joint research university, and its unique curriculum benefited from the global education philosophy it brings to the students. Welcome, Professor Li Men.
Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone. It is a pleasure to be speaking to this year's conference from Shanghai. If I may, I'd like to start with a few disclaimers. My observations today are going to be rooted in my experiences with the Peking University School of Transnational Law, popularly known as STL, and more importantly, with NYU Shanghai, the first Sino-American joint university. These are not typical examples of international education in China, as Bruce noted. To be plain spoken, our school, like DKU, is an elite experiment. STL is a tiny graduate level school within Beida, designed for future lawyers who will be leading the Chinese legal profession in its interactions with the rest of the world. NYU Shanghai is a tiny transnational research university, and its undergraduate program is designed for intellectually gifted students who hold a distinctly cosmopolitan worldview. So my experiences with these two schools are not necessarily germane to universities that have different missions. And I should also say that I'm speaking today just for myself, not for NYU Shanghai as an institution. So let me say just a little bit more about NYU Shanghai. Half our students are from China, half are from the rest of the world. Over the course of 4 years, all our students experience some time as foreign visitors in other nations, and most of them also get to experience some time as hosts to foreign visitors. We crafted a program that aspires to have all of our students develop a deep appreciation for how their own language and culture have partially contributed to their own worldview. A deep appreciation for how other languages and cultures partially contribute to coherent alternative worldviews, and then the quality that the poet John Keats called negative capability, that values moments of tension among divergent perspectives as opportunities to create creative fusions. So we feel very fortunate to have been able to sustain this program. We are now in our 10th year, notwithstanding today's challenges. So to use the vocabulary that is framing this panel, NYU Shanghai is actually not designed to localize international education. We believe that the most intellectually gifted students today need to develop a mindset that fuses multiple perspectives. To do that, one must immerse deeply in a culture that is not one's own. We need our Chinese students to immerse deeply in at least one foreign culture. We need our non-Chinese students to immerse deeply in Chinese culture. So during the first year, the heart and soul of that experience is not actually an attempt to localize in Shanghai. It is really in the dormitory and the classroom. In the dormitory, we assign every student a roommate from another culture. In the classroom, our students take an intellectual history course that promotes cosmopolitan values through the study of brilliant writers from all over the world. This is a course of study that could happen anywhere, not just in Shanghai. Now, to be sure, our non-Chinese students are spending 6 semesters living and studying in China, and we want them to immerse themselves here over the course of that time. And during their 2 semesters in other countries, we want all of our students to immerse themselves in the local cultures there. But I'm actually talking here about the experiential dimensions of their university studies. It may affect some of the topics that they study in different locations, where being present enables a different form of engagement with the subject matter, but the larger pedagogical philosophy, the intellectual philosophy are universal. They're not localized. So people are often asking me, how has the pandemic affected our ability to deliver this kind of education? Well, a small challenge was that for a few semesters, it was hard for our Chinese students to spend 2 semesters in other countries. But those restrictions lifted so as to ensure that at least a semester of overseas study remained possible. The much bigger challenge has been the extended restrictions on foreign students entering China. During the 2 years of the pandemic, we have been fortunate to have some of our international students with us here in Shanghai, but many of them have been stuck outside. That has distorted the multicultural feeling of our school. So instead of being 50-50 Chinese and non-Chinese here in Shanghai, it's more like 2/3 Chinese and 1/3 non-Chinese. And with that mix, it's not so easy for each student to spend 2 hours a day in serious conversation with someone who grew up in a different culture And that is the standard that we strive for in normal times. So, of course, we're trying our best to use Zoom in creative ways in order to maximize multicultural interactions under these constraints, but it's definitely not the same. So I was asked by the organizers of this panel, what will international education in China look like in the post-pandemic world? And I have to say, I think that is the million-dollar question. The kind of education that we are providing doesn't work if all the students in Shanghai are Chinese. We need the international classmates to be here. They need to be in the same dorm here in Shanghai. They need to be eating in the same cafeteria here in Shanghai. They need to be sitting next to our Chinese students in the classroom in Shanghai so that they can continue the conversation after class in the cafe. This fact is simply another feature, I think, of a fact that I actually spent many years working on during my time at American universities in the United States. Elite cosmopolitan education requires a diverse and integrated classroom. So when I was the dean of the University of Michigan Law School, we designed our admissions policy to promote diverse and integrated classrooms. We were sued for having done so. We ultimately prevailed in the United States Supreme Court. But what it takes to provide a diverse and integrated classroom is different in every country. So here in China, we use an admissions policy that produces a 50-50 classroom, half from China, half from 80 countries around the world. But here in China, the main issue actually is not admissions policies right now, it's visas and airlines. And that, I think, brings me back to the main question, which is, where do I see international education in China headed? I am an optimist. I think that the situation that we're facing right now to international students is temporary. I don't know whether things will change in 2 weeks or 2 months or 10 months, but I believe it will change. And when it does, it will be critical for elite institutions in China to get back on track. We need to form intellectual communities that are talented, diverse, and integrated. And then we need to use the pedagogy of active learning curiosity, creativity, and critical analysis. We will be able to restore international education in China to the kind of engine of innovation and talent development that it is really meant to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the speech, Professor Lehman. It is quite eye-opening to learn the innovative curriculum used in higher education in China to build a global mindset. International K-12 schools are also an important segment in the field and have been receiving a lot of attention from the public. Let's welcome Mr. Ren to discuss designs of international curriculum and innovation in the context of Maple Leaf International School. Welcome, Mr. Ren.
非常感谢主持人。10年前呢，我进入了哈佛教育学院学习，那么也有幸呢成为。
10 years ago, thank you, moderator. 10 years ago, I was a student at Harvard School of Education, and Professor Reimers was my professor, and so it is a great pleasure to see him again today, albeit virtually. Coming back to what the organizers had asked me to speak on, today I'm actually going to be speaking about the starting a new era, breaking the dualism of private car versus bus. Let's first start with an analogy. Today, e-hailing car services is something that we're all very familiar with, but only a few years back, we thought there were only two choices: public transport or drive your own car. And for someone like me, I don't have a car, I can't drive a car. So driving a private car to me is a non-possibility. And people who drive their own cars also complain about congestion, about car insurance, about finding a parking spot. They're concerned with those as well. People who use the public transportation are hating the commute every day. So everything has its own disadvantages and strengths. The buses are cheap, private cars are convenient. So is there a possibility where we can combine the advantages of private cars and buses and avoiding the disadvantages? And this is why we now have the web-based car hailing services. When you call for a car on the internet, you can very quickly get to your destination, and you don't have to worry about the private car issues. You don't have to face the discomfort in the transportation and public transportation. And it is not that expensive if we think about it. So I believe this is a great welfare for me. Coming back, coming back to our topic today on international education, we thought that we only had choices of international curriculum and domestic curriculum, which is a dualism. But in 1995, Maple Leaf International School was the first ever school to introduce the British Columbia curriculum into China. And as we introduced that curriculum, the aim was very clear, because we believe that international curriculum has its own advantages. But after the past 20 years of experience, we have seen some changes. International curriculum such as IB, AP, BC, A-level, all of these curriculum, we're actually facing challenges of the changes in social and policy environments. Chinese families are no longer trying to send their children into authentic foreign curriculum. Because Chinese students whose mother tongue is Chinese would have to passively adapt to the new language environment, otherwise they will fail. And so many Chinese students were sent abroad at a very young age, and that also brings its own disadvantages, such as security and safety issues. People have a lot of concerns, and many young students, as they leave China at a young age, their mother tongue becomes deteriorated, and more Chinese overseas students would choose to come back to China for their career development, and that language weakness would matter then. And the Chinese society and government had been increasingly concerned about educational sovereignty, especially with the turmoil situation in Hong Kong. This has brought about some consensus in the Chinese society and government on strengthening the supervision of foreign curriculum and textbooks used in China. But again, I need to emphasize a point. China is very open in this aspect. If they so choose, parents can still provide their children with this education, foreign education. And if we look at domestic curriculum, it can neither meet the international educational needs of Chinese families, nor connect the educational needs of overseas families. This is not hard to understand, because domestic curriculum, the purpose, the language, the pedagogy, and everything else was not aimed at a foreign higher education. It is mostly aimed at Chinese high schools and Chinese universities. And obviously, it is not catered to the foreign students. So because of the ideology differences, language barriers, it is also very difficult to introduce Chinese curriculum overseas. And therefore, we can't directly serve foreign students who want to enter Chinese universities. And we're very, very far from building an international education network like the IB. So let us now reimagine international education. We talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics. So why can't we have international education with Chinese characteristics? Can we then design a curriculum that combines both the advantages of a Chinese and foreign curricula while avoiding the disadvantages of both? So On the one hand, it needs to be positioned differently from existing curricula at home and abroad by tailoring to non-native speakers. It doesn't matter if it's physical, face-to-face teaching or online teaching. And also because it is part of primary and secondary education, it needs to meet mainstream university requirements and meet certain standards so that Chinese students after graduating can choose to go to a Chinese university or a global university. And thirdly, as we talk about Chinese characteristics, we need to preserve the Chinese language, culture, and values. And this would become an important carrier for cultivating future Chinese and foreign exchange. So Maple Leaf has done just that. It has worked very hard to build the world's first international curriculum with Chinese characteristics. And this is the Maple Leaf World School curricula, and it is formed with Chinese and English academic and language courses. It has its own independent intellectual property rights. The R&D started in 2014 and was implemented in September 2020 within the schools in our own group. At the same time, after we've developed the curricula, it has been recognized internationally and it has received accreditation. Cognia UK NESC and 113 support letters from universities in 12 countries. And the distinct Chinese characteristics are reflected not just in the Chinese academic courses, Chinese language courses tailoring for both Chinese students and overseas students, and also in English taught subjects, there are also Chinese elements integrated. So the World School program wants to provide core competence to the future talents who will be able to adapt to a global environment. And we have the rainbow core competence, and these are reflect, act, interact, navigate, bridge, originate, and work together. And in order to provide such core competences, we have built a 3-year compulsory courses for cultivating core competence, personal and global leadership, and creative thinking and problem solving. And these two are newly developed subjects that targets at providing the core competence. Like I said before, we would incorporate those two core competences into all the subjects. So this new curriculum, when being compared to existing domestic and international curricula, such as IB and A-level, it needs to be differentiated. And it is reflected in the target audience, which is students who are learning in a foreign language, ESL, English as a second language, such as Chinese students who were brought up here in China, or CSL students who come from other countries and use Chinese as a second language. So that positioning is very clearly reflected in all the subjects. In all the English taught subjects, we have the 12 teaching strategies for ESL students, and you can see it on the screen. For example, the visuals, the scaffolding lessons, and so on and so forth. And I would like to pay attention to the 7th strategy, which is connecting to local culture. As its name suggests, for Chinese students, when we want to connect to the local culture, it means we will instill classical Chinese literature, Chinese history, in English versions. And so the content they learn is Chinese content taught in English language. And Chinese students, because they have grown up in this country, they already have a certain level of basic understanding, and they can learn it now in good English. And of course, the courses were taught in English as well. And that brings a lot of good results because on the one hand, the student already have some foundational knowledge, and they can understand it easily. And secondly, because it is taught in English, they would accumulate a lot of material of knowledge. So after they graduated from high school, they will be able to tell the Chinese story well using good English. And for the CSL students, we have the Maple Leaf Chinese program, which is in 5 stages and 9 grades. And we have a 16-character strategy where Chinese characters is the basis, the culture is the body, and it is interest-oriented, and there is different ratings and gradings for performance. And so in that experience, the students who are CSL students will be able to gain a better understanding of the host country cultures. And I now have my QR code here, and you can contact me if you're interested.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation, Mr. Ren. With a case study of New York University Shanghai and the Maple Leaf education system, we see the great initiative of international education in China, cultivating a global mindset. How can we expand the impact and broaden the scope to transfer the culture of education? Please join me to welcome Professor Reimers to discuss university-school partnership and the global university network that align with the global vision and will accelerate the transformation of education.
Thank you very much, Max. It is such a pleasure to be in this conference organized by a group of graduate students at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. It's a great example of the agency and commitment of our students to promoting understanding, international understanding. So I'm going to talk about the fact that over the last century, we have lived through what I will call the golden age of internationalization for higher education. But I think that period is coming to an end. I do not know yet what will replace it, because I think that a number of forces are redefining what that next era will be. But there are 4 forces that are challenging the idea that internationalization of higher education is valuable. First, there are political forces, as governments in many different countries are increasing the scrutiny of some of the international activities of universities and of students and professors. And this is increasing the costs of international exchanges for those who participate in them. The second set of forces challenging the idea that internationalization is good are social pressures that are resulting from challenges to the idea that globalization is a beneficial process. And that idea is increasingly challenged by alternative views. I will name 2. A growing populist nationalist set of ideas that essentially believe that nations are better off solving their problems on their own than collaborating with others, and an idea that is an alternative to globalization as a way to collaborate, that says we do need collaboration, but it should be within regional trading economic blocs. The third set of ideas challenging internationalization as beneficial are social processes that require greater social embeddedness of universities, particularly as nations face very serious problems of social inequality, of governance. There are more and more people asking, what is the university doing for society? And the last idea that challenges internationalization are intellectual challenges resulting from a re-examination of an old idea which has animated much internationalization of higher education. And it's the idea that international exchanges can lead to greater understanding and peace. There are more people who are skeptical of the power of that idea today, particularly as we witness the emergence of a violence not seen in Europe since World War II as a result of the aggression on Ukraine by Russia. So I don't have time to discuss these 4 challenges to the idea that internationalization is good. I'm going to discuss one, the notion that internationalization, there is a tension between internationalization and the social embeddedness of universities, that universities are either cosmopolitan institutions or they respond to the needs of society. And I want to suggest that that dichotomy is a false dichotomy, that in fact, the way in which universities can be best embedded socially is by being part of global networks. Great example of that is how universities, how the scientific enterprise during the COVID pandemic was able to produce in record time vaccines. Can you go to the first slide, please? Was able to produce in record time vaccines as a result of the collaboration of the scientific enterprise. Similar things happen in the field of education, and I'm going to refer to them. But what I want to call your attention to today is a recent report produced by UNESCO, by an independent commission of experts commissioned by UNESCO to examine where is the world going and what is it that education could do to address some of the biggest challenges that humanity is facing. In its 77 years, UNESCO has 3 times put together an independent commission that has done something similar. I'll be referring to those 3 times in just a moment. But this report, just released last November, is the very first one that gives universities a central role in the task of transforming not just higher education, but the entirety of education. Next slide, please. So this was a commission. This was the very first and the only in-person meeting of the commission, which took place the first week of January of 2020, because soon after that, we all went into lockdown around the world and we had to continue our work communicating remotely. The president of that commission is the current president of Ethiopia, and the commission includes scholars, educators, university presidents from a number of different countries around the world, including China. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that in its history, UNESCO had 2 times before this one put together a commission to write a report on the futures of education. The first time, when in 1968, it asked the previous Minister of Education of France, Edgar Faure, to chair a commission that produced the report Learning to Be. Now that report devoted 2 lines to higher education. And what those lines said was, higher education should increase access, period. The next time that UNESCO put together a commission to write a report on the futures of education was in 1992, when it asked former chairman of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, to chair a commission that produced a report that devoted 2 pages to higher education. Again, primarily about expanding access. Next slide, please. Now, this report differs from the previous one. Next slide, please. In that it addresses, next one, please. It addresses higher education in each and every one of the chapters of the report. The report is structured in 3 sections. The first section talks about what are the biggest challenges facing humanity, talks about climate change, talks about the challenges to human rights around the world, talks about democratic backsliding, about social inequality, about growing violence and the prospects of violence within nations and among nations, about the challenges caused by artificial intelligence and the economic displacements that it is likely to generate. The second section of the report says we should reimagine what education is and looks like. We should reimagine educational institutions. And to do that, we have to reimagine pedagogy, curriculum, the very organization of educational institutions, the very profession of teaching, and the larger learning ecosystem that enables people to learn throughout their lives. The report is anchored on 3 ideas. One is the idea that every person is a change maker, that the change in the culture of education is not one that governments can decree, but it's one that is going to result when students, professors, teachers, parents, members of civil society, education administrators, and also governments ask themselves, are we on a path to equip the next generation with the skills to address these grave challenges that we face? And if not, what should we do differently? What should we reimagine? And where do we begin in the very institutions that we can influence? The second idea that this report is anchored to is the idea that a world in which human rights are a reality for us, for all, is a more likely world to be sustainable for everyone than a world in which those are not a reality. And the third idea in this report is that in order to address these grave challenges, education needs to be authentic and relevant. Students need to understand how what they learn in school connects to these big challenges in the world of poverty, of democratic backsliding, the challenges to human rights, climate change, inequality, and relevant in that it has to connect with values that are meaningful to students. The next slide. To achieve that reimagination of education, the report argues for 4 levers of change. And I want to suggest that at least 2 of those pertain to universities. First one is the report calls for a much greater commitment to innovation and research so that it is expert knowledge that drives the process of change. And it calls for the engaged participation of universities in the transformation of elementary and secondary schools, as well as the larger ecosystem. It also talks for broad, inclusive, participatory, and democratic dialogue, and for a reimagined international cooperation. Next slide. And so, next slide, please. Next slide. So, next slide. Next slide. So basically, the report is suggesting that universities have the opportunity to become catalytic agents of transformation of the entirety of the education system, and that they can collaborate. There are 28,000 institutions of higher education around the world that, in collaborating across borders, in doing this work of transforming education, we might accelerate the process of innovation and reinvention necessary to produce the reimagining that the report talks about. And so let me stop here because I realize I'm out of time. What I want to suggest is that in addressing the 4 forces that I described at the outset that are questioning the value of international education for universities, at least one of the forces, the one that sees a tension between internationalization and social embeddedness, this report suggests an alternative path. And the path is that international collaborations can actually help universities become more social embedded, can help universities demonstrate that they have the power to improve the communities in which they are embedded, not only the communities of the students who have access to universities. Next slide. And just to conclude, I want to suggest that this is not just an imagining, that universities are doing that. This is a study conducted during the pandemic in which, with my colleagues in the Global Education Initiative, we examined how 20 universities around the world, including Tsinghua University in Beijing, had partnered with schools and education networks to help them innovate, to mitigate the educational impact of the pandemic. The lessons are very powerful. They demonstrate that universities are learning organizations that are open to their external environment and that can not only respond to changes in that environment, but shape that environment and make it better. So I think this report, this recent report of the Commission on the Futures of Education, is an invitation to each of the 28,000 universities to pursue 2 interrelated activities, to better connect with their communities as engines of improvements of elementary and secondary schools, and to integrate themselves into collaborative networks of universities that can exchange the lessons learned in that process and in that way accelerate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Reimers, for your wonderful speech. We believe that through the talks given by our 4 panelists, we all now have a better understanding of the future of international education in China. Here we have prepared a few questions for you all. These questions are rather broader themes of a list of questions we received from our audience before the panel. And without further ado, let's jump ahead to the first one. The first question is that what is the biggest challenge you see in international education at the moment? And looking forward, what are the most critical changes that we must make? Shall we start with Professor Reimers?
Yes, I began my presentation there. As I mentioned, I believe the golden age of internationalization of universities, which was represented by the last century, is over. I do not know what will replace it. I think that there are a number of tensions at the moment that will shape the next era. The 4 challenges to internationalization are the political challenges resulting from governments increasing scrutiny of some of the international activities of universities, students, and professors, which is having a chilling effect, is increasing the costs of participating in those activities. The second are the social pressures that result from the challenges to the idea that globalization is beneficial to us. And I think the 2 dominant views that challenge that idea are populist nationalist views that essentially propose that each country should solve their own affairs independently of global collaborations, and an emerging set of views that recognize the power of trade, but that propose that regional economic trade blocs are the path forward rather than globalization. Third challenge to the idea of internationalization is these social pressures that are asking universities to answer the question, what do you do for society? And the last challenge comes from increasing questions, increasing challenges to an idea that has animated internationalization of universities for the last century, which is the idea that exchanges and mutual knowledge lead to greater understanding and peace. And I think that those 4 sets of challenges are making it a lot harder for universities in the present, in the coming years, to participate in internationalization. And I don't know what the next era will be. I hope it is an enlightened era and not a return to the Middle Ages, but it will be much more challenging than the last decades. I'm certain of that.
Thank you, Professor Reimers. Especially like the 4 challenges you mentioned, like the political tension and also like the difficulty of having like mutual knowledge leading to understanding. I was kind of like hoping to relate this back to your Future of Education report that in the previous video and also in your presentation today, you mentioned like the role of universities nowadays, and like not only as a standalone academic institution, but also as a contributing partner to other educational institutions and programs. I was wondering, Professor Jiang, from your very own experiences of bringing these university into China, these offshore campuses, these programs, these initiatives, what are some challenges you are facing right now, and what are the changes you would like to see in terms of what Professor Reimers mentioned about these like university partnerships and also these challenges, and I guess more broadly the role of university.
International education, the biggest challenge it faces at the moment, I believe, is geopolitical challenges. Geopolitics is the most profound challenge. I won't go into details here. Facing the future, the key is understanding what we need to change. 2 points here. The first one is, I personally believe, as an international university or international education institution, the purpose should always be academic freedom. It is not just at the academic level. Universities have the responsibility of cultivating next generation's talent, and they will be facing these challenges mentioned, including geopolitical challenges. So only when universities turn out world-class talent can they be able to face these challenges. So universities must insist on academic freedom. As a student, of course, they need to have critical thinking abilities. It's a complex world we live in today. What sort of logic are we going to use? How are we going to analyze the situation? This is very important. Cross-border education need to provide the student with such tools. And for a country, take China. I believe Professor Shi Yigong, when he returned to China, has said a few things. He said, China as a major country with thousands of years of history, for it to gain revitalization and contribute to the world, it is not possible without the contribution of world-class universities. Professor Shi Yigong has also been engaging in attempts such as the establishment of the Westlake University. So for students, for universities, and for the general society, these challenges were very real and very profound. Sometimes it confuses people. I was receiving a delegation from Claremont University, also the Dean of Law School of Duke University. He asked me in Beijing, do you think Duke will have success here in China? I said, I can't guarantee that success, but I think China has gone through so many different challenges and setbacks, and it is a major country that accounts for a quarter of the world's population. Can it engage with the world? And as the world marches forward, can China also develop itself and produce wonderful talents that would contribute to China and both the world? And if you say yes to these questions, then Duke will have success in China, because the general climate here in China aims for that greater success.
Thank you, Professor Jiang. And you also mentioned this idea of like having the external tensions we see socially, politically, and also thank you for the examples you share with us. Professor Lehman, do you have something to add, and what do you think are the challenges and I guess potential solutions?
I think the only response we can give is to be vocal and to be authentic and to try to help our societies, whatever they may be, to accept the notion that our ambition collectively is a continuous improvement, and that requires a much more open and honest attitude towards the rest of the world.
Thank you, Professor Lehman, especially this idea of like being local and the robust understanding of the own culture, your own very environment, and I guess the local surroundings in general. Thank you. Mr. Ren, do you have something to add, and from K-12 perspectives, and what do you think the biggest challenge is, and what could be some potential solutions?
I have listened intently to the previous speakers, and I concur with them all. I think the biggest challenge in K-12 is that many people believe it is useless or even detrimental to the development of their children. Some people believe you don't have to go to other countries, therefore there's no need to receive international education. This is actually an overly pragmatic view of education. And many people believe that international schools are only elite education, requires high tuition fees, and it uses foreign textbook, which means that there will be a deviation to the Chinese ideology. All of these are very deeply nationalist and populist views, and this is detrimental to the development of international education, and it is deviating from the central government's policy of continuing the opening up of education. So in China, in this industry, I believe the key change we need to make is we need to be resolute in the upgrading and transformation of this industry. In China, many industries are trying to upgrade themselves and transform themselves. For example, manufacturing. In the past, we would buy assembly lines, and we would help other brands, foreign brands, to produce their stuff. And then we start to have our own R&D, and we start to participate in international standard setting. And so you start with introducing and borrowing, and you continue along that way until you have the capability of R&D yourself. And Huawei is just an example. And in international education here in China, we rarely talk about the transformation of the industry. Majority of the international schools are still borrowing foreign curriculum, introduce foreign teachers, accreditations, and provide the teaching in a foreign language here in China. And these were actually packaged by the immigration agents so that the students can be sent abroad once they complete their international school education here. But in essence, this is still the outcome of involution here in China. There is no IP of our own, and we can't talk about participating in standard setting in international education in any sense. And so this is not matched to the market share and position of China in international education. So if we don't come up with a solution in this aspect, it is at least a shame for the robustness and diversity of international education around the world. So China really needs to lean on its strength, its own market size, to contribute and to matter more. And in 2020, in June, the Ministry of Education, along with several other ministries, have jointly issued a document paper clarifying the building of an education system with Chinese characteristics that is also open. And this is actually pointing out the direction for the entire industry to go forward. So we must ask ourselves, today's China, in international education, do we have a Huawei equivalent in our industry? I don't think there is one. And Maple Leaf wants to become the new Huawei of this industry. And we're working towards that goal. We're building our own world school program. And we wanted to pave the way for global international education to have some Chinese wisdom and contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ren, for this conversation about like the as you said, very last, like the Chinese wisdom and like culture, and how does it related to our curriculum, to our day-to-day teaching, and like how a school is formed in this context. This actually transitions nicely to our next question about, I guess, localization, this topic in general, that we often see people approach issues, challenges they face from a dichotomous approach. Something is either conservative or radical, progressive or backward. And we also hear that in the context of international education. And education ideology is either globally circulated or locally rooted. A school is either global or local, a curriculum is either foreign or national. But as you might already seen from the topic of our discussion today, our goal is to really approach the field by combining these two, local and international, together. So I was wondering, how can the vision of localization of international education be contextualized and put into practice, and how are schools and learners benefiting from localization? Shall we start with Professor Lehman, as you in your presentation mentioned about like not to localize, or like not to like only localize, because NYU Shanghai is expecting this immersion deeply in cultures of others. So could you expand more in terms of like, at least I guess the part that Chinese culture is being immersed by our students, and I guess the benefit of that in terms of how the curriculum is built and how students spend their days, spend their studying time here on campus.
Thank you, Yang. Let me approach that question, I think, in the following way. I think when people are studying in a homogeneous environment, it becomes very easy for a kind of groupthink to emerge. It becomes very, very natural for people who all share the same worldview to look at a problem in mostly similar ways, maybe with different individual variations. And when you have a truly diverse community, I think most students over the course of their education have a moment of shock. They become friends with their classmates, they respect their classmates, they like them, they trust them. And suddenly there's a question that's posed by a professor where they think that the answer is obvious. They think the answer is absolutely clear and no one could disagree. And suddenly they discover that their classmate, who they really respect and like, disagrees completely and has a completely different understanding that is often grounded in a culture, in a worldview, a sense that although there are values that are held in common, maybe one culture would place more emphasis on one and another would place more emphasis on another. And in that moment of opportunity, it's really important for the professor to help the students to get past an impulse to avoid disagreement. There's this expression that, well, we'll just agree to disagree. And that's a shame. That would be a loss. The whole goal in these special teachable moments is to encourage the students to dig in, to understand why they hold different perspectives on an issue, and to understand why multiple perspectives can be coherent, can be well thought through, and how people who hold those different perspectives can actually understand disagreement and express it respectfully, express it because there's a shared curiosity about where these disagreements come from. And I think our institutions and institutions that are trying to take advantage of bringing people to study in new places and different places should be looking for these opportunities and seizing them when they come up.
Thank you, Professor Lehman, for this conversation that we started about like the teachable moment and how these could be potential opportunities for people coming from different backgrounds to talk about like why sometimes they do hold this, they do have this moment of disagreement and what they could each learn from this process. Thank you, Mr. Ren. Do you have something to add yourself, as both the curriculum designer and also a school administrator from K-12 perspectives?
首先呢，我觉得是要解决人才结构的问题。
First, I think we need to solve the problem of talent structure. We can step outside the education industry and look at the practices of other industries. There are a lot of good multinationals that are successful, and many are from abroad. They hire local staff in marketing and R&D. Localization itself is about respecting local culture and patterns. If the talent structure itself is not localized, how can we really move on to deep understanding of local culture? If the core staff of an institution, namely your leaders, professors, are all foreign and international, and none of the teaching activities or research activities have the participation of local staff, then we can't say this is a local education. And of course, it is important to have the participation of a purely international staff and faculty. But I think the main force it has to be the bilingual team that can truly understand localization, because these people and have the advantages that monoculture background people do not have. Also, the concept of international education and local education are actually contradictory to each other. But this is a misconception. These two are seemingly contrasting one another, but there is a coherence between them. One is international, the other is local. And well, for instance, mass production and individualization or customization can be combined. When we go to Starbucks, we can customize our drinks that are completely different from what is ordered by other customers. And no matter which country you're in, you can always have your personalized Starbucks. So behind customization and individualization, it is the improvement of a standardization. That is what I call mass standardization or mass personalization. Of course, we need to tailor education to individuals, and that is contradictory to economic patterns. But if we all jump out of the dichotomy, we would see that the first is a mindset change. We need to accept the contradiction or on the facade. International education today is about achieving on localization and internationalization or globalization at the same time, so that we can have a mass supply, so that the accessibility and availability of education can be improved, so that those that do not have access can benefit as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ren, for this conversation again from your very mimic comparisons between business industries and so also in education, and this idea of like mass personalization. I was wondering, Professor Jiang, do you have something to add? And could we keep conversation to 2 minutes per person so that we have time to go through everyone?
Two things. Well, localization of international education is about two things: teachers and students. As a teacher, in K to 12, the teacher plays a crucial role. A good teacher must be someone who is an expert at liberal arts, because such a person knows how to combine education practices from across the world in order to pursue the nature of education. At the same time, it is a person that can guide students into becoming a talent that is needed by the society, and become what is needed by its nation. And this is not the narrow concept of nationalism, but rather, a person that has love towards nations across the world. And also, it's about exchanges. Well, I was the first cohort of students in China that had access to university after Cultural Revolution. I had the benefit of studying abroad, and I understand how international exchanges are crucial in dispelling misconceptions and misunderstandings. Without such exchanges, misunderstandings arise. I think in 2002, there was an innovative school called Minova in the US that was established. And it started on a grade on year 3, there is no physical campus, and the lessons were provided in 7 countries. And the university did not teach students rights and wrongs, instead 4 mindsets. They are first theoretical analysis, but I'm not going to elaborate. And so it's very thorough and sophisticated theoretical analysis. The second, empirical analysis, which trains students in the ways of analyzing problems in a scientific and logical way. And the third, the systematic analysis. And the fourth is Minerva. And I have been very lucky to have met the founder of Minerva. Well, Minerva University teaches students principles and strong logic so that they don't blindly follow the crowd. And there is a myriad of information provided by so many media. So students need to distinguish what's right, good from and the opposite. They need to know what's good and kind and beautiful with their own critical thinking and analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jiang. Professor Reimers?
I think the tension between internationalization and localization is an old one in higher education, but I believe it was resolved with the creation of the modern university in 1811. So universitas, the Latin word for university, means the whole, total, the universe, the world. And this is where the name of the university comes from. Universities have always been cosmopolitan institutions. And that's the reason why medieval universities taught in a language they believe was more universal, Latin, as opposed to national languages. But in 1811, when William Humboldt chartered the University of Berlin, the first University of the Enlightenment, it helped to resolve that tension because the University of the Enlightenment had to advance a world ruled by human reason, in which ordinary people could rule their lives and improve their communities. So that forced localization, assisted by the power of science. So that's the reason Benjamin Franklin, another important figure in the American Enlightenment, created the University of Pennsylvania at a time when Harvard and Yale were still teaching in Latin and teaching mostly about Europe. And it's the reason why John Adams, an important figure in the creation of the American experiment, chartered the American Academy of Arts and Sciences with a view that higher education, arts and sciences should contribute to the development of the local economy and of the new republic, again, localization. It was the same principle that animated the Morris Land Grants Act of 1862 in the United States that conceived of universities as engines of regional, economic, and social development. So as I explained in my presentation, this notion that global and local are somehow opposed is a misnomer, is a mistake. When we teach our students to understand deeply what the UN Sustainable Development Goals are, what is poverty, and why should we commit to a world without poverty, and what causes poverty, or what are the causes of hunger, and how do we build a world in which we have no hunger, and so on. We don't teach them to recognize these concepts in the abstract. We teach them to understand that these concepts that define a compact for a better world, for a better humanity, find expression in their communities, in their backyards. And so the kind of experiential learning that Professor Lehman was talking about is done in contexts that are simultaneously local and global, helping students understand, helping students become decenter, helping them understand that they are members of many communities that are interconnected, and helping them cultivate agency and efficacy to act in communities that are local, but also global. So I think that this notion that universities should either be international or local reflects a pre-Enlightenment idea of, is a very medieval idea. Since 1811, the modern universities have been working to help students precisely understand those connections. And I think that the reason international education is intrinsical to the idea of the modern university is precisely because it helps students understand not the global at the expense of the local, but how those two things are intertwined, interdependent.
Thank you, Professor Reimers. That we kind of trace back to 1811 to to discuss this idea of like international versus local as a binary comparison there, and using language of instruction, as you mentioned, as a concrete example, and also the idea of like learning from the very own community. Due to time limits, we didn't get a chance to go through all the amazing questions we received from the audience today. We'll review all of them afterwards, and we do understand this is merely a start of the discussion, and please do stay tuned as we will later post a discussion of some of those questions. Thank you all for sharing, and this concludes today's roundtable session.
Thank you, Yang. And I want to take a minute to thank all our panelists and audience to participate in the conversation about international education in China. We wish you a wonderful rest of the weekend. Thank you.